Okay, so good morning. It's 9:05. If everyone can hear me, good morning to all of you. My name is Patricia Lorenz, and I was asked to do the moderation of this webinar. I will keep myself as short as possible. So firstly, I would like to welcome, of course, members of the European Parliament and Minister of Energy of Luxembourg, Claude Turmes in particular. I also have to say that unfortunately, Minister Lenore Gewessler from the Austrian Ministry of Climate Action Energy will not be able to join us, but I'm pleased to announce that Mr. Stefan Renner, who is her policy advisor on energy in the cabinet, will replace her and join us already after 10 o'clock. And that's all from my side. Let's start with the program. The introduction will be given by Mrs. Evelyn Regner. She is member of the Parliament for the S&D Group. Michelle Rivasi, who also organized this very important webinar. Thank you very much. She will, of course, also say a few words. And Mrs. Cornelia Ernst for the group of the left. Michelle Rivasi, for those which is impossible, might not know, is, of course, with the Green groups. So until 9:15. Please, I think Mrs. Regner would start.
Einen ausgezeichneten schönen guten Morgen wünsche ich. Danke an Michelle Rivasi und vor allem auch natürlich.
Thanks to Michelle Rivasi and everyone else for organizing today's event, because this is a very complicated but also very important topic where many important questions remain open, which leads to a large need for discussion, which is why it's so important to organize events such as today's. With their action plan, the Commission tackled the topic or started the debate on sustainable financing. This is, of course, a very important step in tackling challenges such as climate change and pollution. But in 2022, we see huge contradictions in the taxonomy. The question is, does the taxonomy meet the needs, meets its expectations to become the global gold standard for sustainable financing, especially as far as nuclear energy is concerned and included in the taxonomy? And if we have a very vague definition of gas as a transitional energy source, I would have to say, no, it doesn't meet these needs. Nuclear energy cannot be conformed to the taxonomy. It cannot be sustainable simply due to nuclear waste. There are huge risks connected to nuclear energy that can have destructive consequences on sustainability goals, which is why Austrian members of the European Parliament have objected with the support of the Austrian minister and Mr. Renner will be speaking for her, and the Social Democratic Group have sent several letters, 2 letters by now, to the European Commission why the taxonomy is currently unacceptable in its current state. Within the Parliament, we're also supporting the work of the relevant committees with their objections against the taxonomy. We think that the credibility of the European Parliament, of the European Union, and of the Green Deal is at risk, and that the goal of climate neutrality until 2050, certainly even more. It's my great pleasure to be able to participate today, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion with all of our participants today.
Thank you very much. Michelle? Please.
Merci, merci à tout le monde. Merci d'être là pour ce webinaire.
Hello everyone, thank you for attending to this meeting today.
On a quelques semaines pour convaincre.
To be quite honest, we have
Parce que cette taxonomie, comme ça a été dit par ma collègue, et merci, c'est quand même des critères qui permettent de favoriser l'investissement privé et public pour les énergies d'avenir, notamment les énergies vertes. Et là, on voit qu'on est en train de tordre la science. Parce que quand on voit l'historique, quand ça a été fait en 2018-2019, et je remercie les rapporteurs,
as was done in
que ce soit
2018
Sirpa
and
Petikainen pour le
2019,
PPE ou
and
que ce
I
soit
thank
Basse
the
Écoute pour les
reporter,
Verts.
Madame Pleitikainen
Ça
for
reposait
the
vraiment
EPP
sur des normes
and Vasakou
scientifiques.
for the
D'ailleurs, on
Greens,
avait le
worked
groupe
based
d'experts
on
techniques
science.
qui avait
We
été
had a
choisi par la
technical
Commission, qui
expert
avait
group,
exclu le
TEG,
nucléaire
chosen by
et
the
le gaz.
Commission, which
Et
excluded
puis,
the
ça ne
nuclear
plaisait pas à
and the
certains
gas
États membres,
energies.
dont mon président de la
But,
République,
of
M.
course,
Macron.
it was not
Donc, on a fait
pleasant
appel
for
au
some member
JRC.
states,
Le JRC, c'est...
including my
Je connais
president,
bien cette
Emmanuel
structure
Macron.
parce que
And the GRC
elle
was
est très
called up
liée,
to
au moins
rescue, and
25% de ses
I'm very
activités sont
familiar
liées
with this
au
structure because
nucléaire.
20%
Et
of
il
its
travaille beaucoup
activities
pour
are
une association qu'on
associated to
appelle
nuclear
Foratom,
energy. They are
qui
working for
est
an
pro-nucléaire à
association called
100%.
Foratom,
Donc, ce n'est pas des
which
gens
is
vraiment très
completely
indépendants.
supportive of
Et le
nuclear
JRC,
energy. These people are
justement,
not
lui,
fully
il a inclus
independent.
le
The
gaz et le
GRC
nucléaire parce qu'il
included
fallait faire
gas
plaisir aux
and
Français
nuclear in
et
order
aux
to
Allemands.
please the French and the Germans.
Et puis là, il y a eu la plateforme des
Then
finances
there was
qui a
the
été très
finance
claire, qui est
platform.
venue
It was
témoigner
crystal
devant la
clear
commission
in
Envie
its
pour dire on
testimony
ne
to
peut
the
pas
Envy
accepter le
committee.
gaz et le
It
nucléaire.
said gas and
Alors,
nuclear cannot
moi,
be accepted
qui
in the
suis un peu une
taxonomy.
spécialiste du nucléaire, de par ma formation,
Through
je
my
peux vous
training,
dire
I'm a
que
specialist of nuclear.
quand on a mis
And
ce
I
gaz
can
et
tell
ce
you
nucléaire,
that
c'était
when
avant
gas and nuclear
ce qui se passe en
energy
Ukraine,
was
et
included,
notamment
it was
la
before
menace
the
que font
situation
courir
in
les Russes,
Ukraine.
mais aussi les Ukrainiens d'ailleurs,
And with the
sur des
threat
centrales
of the
nucléaires
Russians
civiles.
and
Que
the
ça
Ukrainians
soit à
on
Tchernobyl où
civil
on a un
nuclear
stockage de
power
déchets
plants.
radioactifs, même si la
In
centrale ne
Chernobyl, for
fonctionne plus,
example,
puisqu'elle a
where
explosé,
nuclear
que ça
waste are
soit
being
à
stored, even though
Zaporovitch,
the
on voit que le
power
nucléaire
plant is no
devient
longer
aussi
working, or in Zaporizhzhia
une
as well.
arme.
We
Ça
can
peut être
see
une
that
bombe
nuclear
environnementale, ce
energy
nucléaire.
is used
Et que
as a
lorsque,
weapon. It
quand
can
on voit
be
les
an
critères, on disait
environmental
oui,
bomb.
mais le risque d'accident, il est
But
tellement faible
these
qu'on ne le prend
people
pas en
tell us that the
considération. Mais vous voyez que là,
environmental risk
il y a à la
is
fois le
so
risque
low
d'accident d'un
that
point de
it's
vue
not taken into
technologique,
account.
comme on
But
l'a
here
vu
we can
à
clearly
Tchernobyl,
see
sur les
that there
catastrophes
are
naturelles avec le
technological
tsunami, comme
risks,
on a vu
as
à
we saw
Fukushima.
in
Et
Chernobyl.
là,
There are
en cas
natural
justement
disaster
de guerre,
issues, as
eh
we
bien,
saw
le
in
nucléaire
Fukushima.
constitue
And
vraiment un
again, in
risque
case
énorme.
of war, nuclear
Et donc,
energy is
j'espère
an
que ce
enormous,
webinaire va
gigantic
apporter
risk. And I
quand même
hope
des
that
informations
this
là-dessus, parce
webinar
que
will give us
si la
information on
Commission,
this.
le
Indeed,
31
if the
décembre
Commission on the
2020,
31st
a
of
proposé
December
cet acte
2020
délégué,
put forward
c'est
this
très
delegated
important que
act,
tous nos collègues
it
au
is of
Parlement
the
européen,
utmost
puisqu'il faut
importance that all our
353
colleagues at the
membres du
European
Parlement
Parliament,
qui
because
votent
we need
justement en objection
353
par rapport à cet acte
voting
délégué, c'est
in
très
favor of
important
the
que le Parlement
objection
européen
against the
ait une
delegated act.
attitude
It is
qui
of the
repose
utmost
sur les
importance
sciences et qui ne
that
repose
those
pas sur
MEPs work
des
based
idéologies.
on science
Donc,
and not
voilà
on
pourquoi il me
ideology.
semble très important,
Hence,
avec tous les intervenants qu'il y a
in my
là,
opinion,
de
the
voir quelle est la
importance
stratégie qu'on va
of
faire. Moi, j'en vois une
discussing the
déjà, c'est bien
strategy we
sûr
are going to
de
implement.
convaincre les
For
différents
me, it is
parlementaires
important
européens,
to
quel que
convince
soit
the
leur bord
different
politique, parce que
MEPs,
là, on n'est plus,
whatever the
on est dans
political family.
les rapports de force,
Here, clearly,
mais on n'est
it
plus dans les
is
sciences.
a power
Et puis
balance
après,
that is
notre
required.
dernier recours, ça sera la
The debate is
justice.
no longer based
Et on
on
verra ce que va
science,
dire
and then
notre
the last
collègue
resort is
d'Autriche et notre
justice.
collègue de Luxembourg.
We'll hear what
Voilà.
our colleagues from
Donc,
Austria and
je suis
Luxembourg
tout
will tell us
oui,
about
comme on dit
that.
en français,
I'm all
à
ears,
l'écoute
fully
des différents
attentive,
arguments par
and
rapport à
will
cette
pay a lot of
taxonomie
attention to the different
qui n'en
arguments
est
put
plus
forward
une,
on the taxonomy
ou
that is no longer
très dirigée
taxonomy,
par
or
rapport à ce
at
qu'on veut
least
y
that is
mettre.
fully directed
Merci.
with regard to its content. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's clear from the introduction where we are right now. I see that Member of the Parliament, Cornelia Ernst, didn't make any time, but she will join us later for the discussion. So I think we continue, of course, with the presentations, because one of the questions is, of course, how could the taxonomy work? I mean, there's also technical questions around this. So we're happy to welcome an expert on these issues, Mr. Wolfgang Pointner, who is advisor at the Austrian Central Bank. And in his presentation, which is called The Consequences of the Taxonomy for Financial Markets, he will try to explain this to us. And afterwards, we have the discussion on the legal topics. Mr. Pointner, the floor is yours.
So I'll just share my presentation with you. Can you see it now? So I would like to
No,
speak
we do
about.
not.
No?
No, you should share your screen. At the
Okay.
bottom half your screen on Zoom.
Try again. So. Do you see it now?
We do.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I make it full screen. Okay. So I would like to talk about the financial market aspects of the taxonomy and the possible inclusion of nuclear energy into the taxonomy.
We again do not see your presentation. If you go full screen, you have to go to the screen of your presentation.
But now you can see it?
No.
No. Okay, that's interesting. I'll try again.
You did see it in the earlier attempt.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now, and it is in full screen presentation. So I would advise you to keep it this way.
Yeah, fine. So I would like to talk about the financial market aspects, as I said before. So what is the taxonomy to financial market participants? It answers one of the very important questions, that is, how can investors identify what are sustainable investments? Because the taxonomy, as you know, is this classification of economic activities that do contribute at least to one of the EU's climate objectives. It is also important to say that it is just a list of green activities, but not of brown activities, as it would also be important to see for financial investors which activities actually are detrimental to sustainability in Europe, because that would also, these activities, of course, have the greatest risks to investors. So, sorry. If you take the taxonomy, you know which activities are actually contributing positively to sustainability, but you do not know who actually is engaging in these activities. And to get that kind of information, we need more information that is mandatory disclosed. And therefore, we have some regulations on disclosure. And if firms actually do disclose their economic activities and the contribution to sustainability of their activities, then investors can actually make taxonomy aligned investments, which means they can choose those kind of investments that actually really help us to avoid climate change, or at least to mitigate climate change in the long run. And to use as a financing instrument here, for example, they can choose green bonds, because these green bonds should be aligned with the taxonomy. The activities that are financed by green bonds should be aligned with the taxonomy. And in the end, we also have some regulations on so-called benchmarks, which are instruments to assess the performance of your own investment in comparison to other investment options that are also aligned with the taxonomy. So these are the main instruments of the sustainable finance strategy by the EU from a financial market perspective. And as you can see here, the market for green bonds has been growing quite, dynamically. So we saw some very strong growth rates over the last couple of years. And even for this year, for 2022, it is expected by most market participants that the global market for green bonds will actually exceed a volume of 1 trillion euros, which is quite significant, I would think. And it's also worth mentioning that the European market in green bonds is actually the biggest green bond market in the world. So why is it so important that the market for green bonds is big, or deep and liquid, as we could also say? Liquid markets have a lot of advantages, especially to institutional investors. If you have a liquid market, that means there are a huge number of buyers and sellers. It also means that you can sell your assets at any point in time at the given market rate. And this is especially important to institutional investors because they usually buy very huge tickets. Institutional investors like a pension fund or an insurance company would not buy 100,000 euros worth of green bonds or 200,000. They would go for 10 million, for 5 million, for maybe 20 million euros worth of green bonds. And if you hold such a huge position in the market, you also want to make sure that if you want to sell that particular position, that particular assets, you want to really make the very same amount or roughly the same amount that it was priced at the time you bought it, or actually at the time you decided to sell it. And this is only true in a very liquid market, because if you have an illiquid small market.
Car dans des marchés liquides, dans des petits marchés, nous pouvons avoir d'énormes montants et le prix du marché s'écroulerait. Et donc, on aurait forcément des...
And so, why is it so important to have institutional investors in that market? Because this is where the big money is. And we know that we have to finance very huge technological changes. We have to finance new ways of transportation. We have to finance a total change in our energy system. And these changes really require enormous amounts of money. And therefore, we need the support and the investment of institutional investors. So if we would include nuclear energy in the taxonomy, it could have advantages for the producers of nuclear energy, for those companies who run nuclear power plants, because actually, if the nuclear energy is included, then and we also create this huge liquid market, there might be additional demand for for these kind of bonds that are used to finance nuclear power plants. And also, if, let's say, investment fund managers decided to open a so-called green fund for green investments, they could also include nuclear power plants. And that makes the funding of nuclear power plants a bit cheaper. I mean, I give you here an example how this increasing demand for particular kind of bonds actually increases the price and therefore lowers the yield. It means it makes the funding of this particular enterprise in the long run cheaper. And this is actually what the policymakers who want to include nuclear power into the taxonomy are aiming for. They want to make it cheaper to finance this kind of energy. So why is that? Maybe why? So I'll give you now some reasons why this could be troublesome from a financial market perspective. Because as we have already seen in the reactions to this decision to include nuclear power, there are several very big players in financial markets who have already explained they would abstain from buying anything that is used for funding of nuclear power. For example, we have heard from the European Investment Bank that they would not buy any products, any financial instruments that are used to finance nuclear power. And this, in turn, would then lead to a fragmentation of the market for green bonds, because you would have kind of green bonds that include nuclear power, and you would have another kind of green bonds, let's call them green bonds plus or whatever you want to call them, that would exclude nuclear power. And then you basically lose the very important objective of creating this one big liquid market, because you actually fragment the market for green bonds again. And it also creates a certain layer of uncertainty, because you really have to check as an investor when you decide to invest into green bonds, you really have to check yourself whether that kind of green bond or that kind of green fund that you are buying is actually including nuclear power or not. Because as we also have seen, there are many young people who want to invest in green bonds for their retirement. And they also want to see a clean and sustainable environment at the time when they retire. And therefore, they want to exclude any kind of nuclear investments from their investment plans. And for them, it would then be very difficult to, they would have to scrutinize these financial instruments, which often is very cumbersome, and you then don't have the sufficient information. And therefore, then in the end, people would probably lose the confidence or the trust into this kind of standard that we actually wanted to create by the establishment of the green bond standard. Two other possible financial risks that are associated with nuclear power is on the one hand, the default risk, because as I said, it was already said by the MEP before, there is a non-negligible risk of accidents in nuclear power plants, and these kind of accidents have much more significant effects than, let's say, if you have an accident in a water power plant or in a wind park. And then the costs that are associated with these accidents are enormous and might also have to be borne by the producer or by the company that ran the nuclear power plant. And this is a very significant default risk. Then you have a regulatory risk, as we have seen, for example, after the accident in Fukushima, that has already been mentioned. If there would be another nuclear accident in the next couple of years, it might be that some jurisdictions decided to leave nuclear power, to ban nuclear power actually, which is also a huge risk for the kind of companies that engage in this kind of activity. And finally, you have the litigation risk. And this is something that comes to the point that some of these effects of nuclear power accidents, for example, are completely not insurable. And so if this kind of accident happens and you have no insurance policy at hand, then you might go into very long and extremely expensive litigation processes. So all these kind of financial risk, and I wanted to stress that I'm speaking here purely in terms of financial market risks, because I'm not an expert on nuclear power or on any kind of energy technology, but these kind of financial risks actually make it seem like not the best idea to include nuclear power. So thank you for your attention. That would be all from my side for the moment.
Thank you very much for the very interesting insight into the world of finances. We have time for questions later, so we continue with the presentation on nuclear energy and the taxonomy regulation, which is an overview on the legal opinion which was commissioned by the Austrian Federal Ministry, and is, if I understand correctly, will be the basis for a possible lawsuit if the taxonomy will be adopted. We have two speakers who also prepared this opinion from Redeker and Selnadas legal company. We have Simone Lünenburger and Mr. Corbinian Reiter, I think, who will share this presentation. The floor is yours.
Ja, vielen Dank. Zunächst die Frage, können Sie die Präsentation alle schon sehen?
Thank you very much. First of all, the question, can you see the presentation?
Ja?
Yes?
Wunderbar.
Good.
Ja, mein Name ist Simone Lünenburger.
My name is Simone Lünenburger. I will be presenting with Mr. Reiter. We're both lawyers at Redeker Selnadas. I'm directing our Brussels office in Berlin, and we are looking into the legal side of taxonomy and nuclear energy that we've examined in a legal opinion for Austria. Just a very brief overview of the topics we will be tackling in this presentation today. The most important elements that we've had to check is, does nuclear power contribute to one of our climate change goals, climate change mitigation adaptation? Those were the two main focus points of the core green goals, as they were included in the delegated regulation. Second criterion, does it cause any significant harm to any of the other environmental objectives of the taxonomy regulation? A few words about regulation itself. The delegated regulation, as it is presented, nuclear energy in general wasn't declared ecologically acceptable, but only certain aspects and areas of it. It's too long to go into detail, but we have the pre-commercial stages of advanced technologies is one area. Second, new nuclear power plant projects. Third area, changes or modernization of existing installations. The second two, with time limitations. New projects have to be approved or receive a permit until 2045, and changes or modernizations have to be authorized by the authorities by 2040 to fall under the delegated regulation for the taxonomy. Now, let's look at the legal aspects of this. We think from a procedural point of view, we think that the procedures to get to the delegated regulation that has accepted these types of nuclear energy as acceptable is not legally correct, because there are certain requirements and there were procedural flaws from our point of view. There was a lack of an impact assessment, first of all. There has been no public consultation. Furthermore, and quite expressly against what the taxonomy demands, the expert groups of the member states and the platform have been consulted at the same time in a very hasty way, instead of one after the other, because normally it should have to be the platform first and afterwards the member states expert groups in order to be able to react to each other. And there was insufficient time allowed for the platform and the member states expert group to prepare their comments. You will have noticed it. It was in the media. This was started in the time of Christmas and New Year's, and there was barely any time to prepare an opinion or reaction. This is the list of procedural flaws. Now let's go to the material aspects. The first criterion that Ms. Lüneburg has already mentioned, that nuclear power would have to fulfill to be sustainable, is that it would have to contribute in an essential way to climate change mitigation. You can see it on the screen in detail. The article is detailed. You cannot just simply include everything, but there are two important details that you have to take away here. The Commission itself states that nuclear energy is neither green nor an enabling activity for renewable or green energy. Low carbon is not necessarily renewable or green, and it's not enabling green or renewable activities, economic activities. And this would be what is mentioned in paragraph 1 of Article 10. So you cannot include nuclear power under this article. It is considered a bridging technology, or at least that's what they're trying, but this is regulated exclusively in paragraph 2 of Article 10. Now, does this nuclear energy qualify for this article? The requirements for this article as a bridging the gap technology are the following. According to our definition, it has to be a carbon-intense activity, and it has to follow the best-in-class approach. So it has to offer the best performance amongst carbon-intense activities. Second criterion, it has to contribute to reaching the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. And thirdly, in order for such technologies to be usable, there has to be no technologically or economically feasible low carbon alternative. Lastly, the development and the use of this energy cannot be an obstacle to low carbon alternatives. I'm missing a slide, so let me go back a little. Forward, please. Yes, this is this is where we ended up. Now, applying this, if we try to apply this 4 criteria to nuclear energy, nuclear power, we come to the conclusion in our legal opinion and analysis of the delegated regulation, this nuclear power does not meet the requirements as stated in this delegated act according to the taxonomy regulation, because it's first of all not covered by the scope, because nuclear power is considered as a low carbon activity, but this is only applicable to intense carbon activities. Secondly, there are feasible alternatives in renewables combined with smart grids and storage technology. In this combination, they can be an alternative. They are available on the markets, and the Commission is relying on a somewhat softened criterion that they may not yet be commercially available at a sufficient scale, but this is not present in the text of the regulation. They're softening the text expressively in order to be able to include nuclear power. Next element, there are considerable doubts regarding contribution to climate neutrality of nuclear power plants that will only receive a permit in 2040, 2045, which means they will not go on the grid until 2050 or later. But the climate goals are set for 2050. And our last point, there is, at the very least, a lack of investigation how including nuclear power and financing for renewables and other energy sources, because these are not completely complementary. There is a competition between those types of energy models and sources, and this could thus be an obstacle to financing for renewable energies. This would be what we call a cannibalizing effect. Thank you. I'll be taking over again. In order to be sustainable, nuclear power will have to contribute to one of the climate goals. The Commission has chosen climate mitigation according to Article 10, but also has to contribute to climate change adaptation according to Article 11. You can see Article 11 on the screen right now. Here you see in detail the criteria. You might think that the goal of climate change adaptation should only include in its scope general measures that substantially reduce the risk of adverse impact of the current climate and the expected future climate on economic activity. But that's not the only case that's been planned for. It also includes measures that protect the economic activity itself from the adverse impact of the current climate. For example, you could construct a nuclear power plant in such a way that would protect it from flooding and other consequences of climate change. And this point of view, that Article 11, in addition to Article 10, is part of the delegated regulation, has not been sufficiently tackled in the public or in the press. So investments for nuclear power, so investments that make nuclear power that is already existing more resilient to climate change can be recognized as sustainable. The problem is that you cannot really separate the cost of these measures from other measures. For example, a safe way of constructing a nuclear power plant could fall under the scope, but that means that construction costs can be designated ecologically sustainable in a huge scope. And there are no figures about this. There's no estimation of size, and the experts didn't give any evaluation on this, because their evaluation was mostly focusing on Article 10 and Article 17. We see a deficit here. The other criterion is, could nuclear power cause significant harm to any of the other level objectives of the taxonomy regulation? and how to check the environmental impact according to Article 17, paragraph 2 is the activity itself, but its whole life cycle from beginning to end as well. And the current discussion about the do no significant harm, DNSH, is of course a heated debate. It's a scientific debate between experts about the risks of nuclear power, which is why we ask ourselves, where can legal measures actually fit into this? Now, what we see here is paragraph 2 of Article 17, especially as far as the life cycle as a whole is concerned. The Commission has explicitly excluded uranium mining and milling out of this of the current delegated act, and these activities mostly happen outside of the European Union. But since uranium mining and milling are part of the life cycle of nuclear energy, are necessarily the first step of creating nuclear energy, that this should lead to the conclusion that analyzing the life cycle of nuclear energy should lead to a classification of nuclear power being completely incompatible with Article 17 as a whole. Second legal aspect that's very important from our point of view is the application of the precautionary principle according to Article 191 of TFEU, and that is referred to in Article 19. There are three perspectives of the precautionary principle to our case. First of all, there's the burden of proof. Because the precautionary principle does not only enter into force when there is the proof of it, because it's simply part of the precautionary principle. There is no proof that the risk of is sufficient. It's that the risk is not only hypothetical, and I think nuclear power clearly has inherent risks. The second aspect here is that precautionary principle assumes an unacceptable type of risk. So we have the very ambitious approach of the tax regulation of ecological sustainability. And given this has to be included into what an acceptable risk would be, we need a lower level of risk tolerance. This, of course, means that respect of legal requirements for nuclear power cannot be sufficient for this, because regulations for nuclear power only try to make nuclear power safe as part of the energy mix, and if they include it, it has to be as safe as possible. But the goal of ecological sustainability goes beyond that. The scientific verification in itself is part of the precautionary principle, and the best available scientific data and most recent international research results. And if we take all of these three perspectives together, in looking at nothing, given the low risk tolerance that should be part of the taxonomy regulation due to the precautionary principle, that we should assess according to latest scientific research that in spite of fulfilling the safety requirements, there might still be relevant risk towards sustainability goals and environmental goals. And since the Commission has bound the criteria simply to the legal regulation of nuclear power in general, we think that the assessment of the precautionary principle has not been properly fulfilled, or at least we doubt that. This is particularly applicable to three aspects of nuclear power related to different environmental goals. First of all, climate change adaptation. For example, as far as conflicts of interest regarding the use of water are concerned, then of course the risk of severe accidents that is empirically proven, which is therefore not a hypothetical risk, and the consequence of contaminations, not only for human life, but also for ecosystems, because people can be evacuated, the ecosystems and the wildlife cannot. A third aspect is the lack of empirical examples when it comes to disposal facilities for high-level radioactive waste. And any prognosis about safety will become more and more unsafe the further you look into the future. And if we look at the time frame we're dealing with here, it will necessarily be unsafe in the end. And the question is if this can be combined with the low level of risk acceptance in the taxonomy itself. These are the material aspects of this opinion. And let's now get back to the legal action. Because what happens if we don't find a majority in Parliament and Council for an objection against this delegated act? So this will enter into force, which opens the possibility of suing against. There's, of course, the possibility of also to nullify this, that the European Parliament, the European Council, and the institutions, as well as the member states, are those who can sue, do not have to prove that they are entitled to sue, can just sue immediately. But I have to mention that a court of the member states could also directly present this case to the European Court of Justice, but this would require a legal dispute on a national level, for instance, during implementation related to taxonomy. And if it ends up in front of the European Court of Justice, the court will verify this very seriously. And there's a full examination of all legal questions on a fundamental level. And that means that they will check if this is correct according to Article 10, paragraph 2, probably Article 11. And these are mostly legal questions. And also the requirements that are deduced from the precautionary principle and the taxonomy regulation in the recitals and the norms and standards. So now this, of course, concerns the deductions and the legal questions. For there is a certain margin of movement for do no significant harm. These are partly scientific questions, partly this has to be evaluated by the courts, but they also verify these questions, and they are not afraid to check these things. And there is what is called a manifest error test for reviewing complex technical appraisals of the European Commission, and they will not only check the studies and the proofs that if they are correct and complete, so accurate, reliable, and consistent, or then if everything has been included, or if something has been intentionally left out or forgotten. Are there any gaps in the examination or the research? And the last step of this manifest error test is a plausibility check if all of the studies submitted support the conclusions drawn from it. And if we apply this test, we think that there have been manifest errors in evaluation, as my colleague has just described. So in conclusion, it is doubtful whether nuclear energy can fall within the scope of Article 10, paragraph 2. As far as Article 11 is concerned, with a very large interpretation of investment cost for climate change adaptation to make nuclear power plants safer could fall under the scope of Article 11 and could be classified as ecologically sustainable. And the Article 17 criterion of doing no significant harm becomes even more important to that, because this could be decisive in the end. This might lead to less control on a legal level, but the life cycle approach of Article 17, paragraph 2 is a standard that is immediately verifiable, and we think there are several points where we can attack the validity of nuclear power under Article 17. And furthermore, there's another aspect we want to mention that we haven't addressed yet, which are the significant consequences in practice, because this remains very exciting. This also links to Mr. Pointner's point. Transition activities are to be reported separately according to Article 5. And under this article, the Commission has stated that furthermore should be defined for nuclear energy and gas special disclosure obligations. So it seems as if the Commission was intending this fragmentation of the market, that every investor has to look at the green bonds to see what's hiding behind it, instead of the supposed goal of transparency with the taxonomy regulation. At least that's something, a conclusion you could draw from this specific statement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for the absolutely brilliant overview over all those many points that are around with the current complementary delegated act. I think we are now from content slowly moving towards the strategy debate, which is the also the second part. Before we enter this, we have a last presentation by Mr. Julian Schwarzkopf from the Deutsche Umwelthilfe, who will give us the reasons for the German government to become active on this issue. Mr. Schwarzkopf, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. First of all, can you all see my presentation? Perfect. So thank you to the organizers for making this a very important event possible. I will today be presenting legal arguments against including fossil gas in the taxonomy. This is based on a legal opinion we commissioned in January of this year. Yes, I'm not an environmental lawyer by training. I'm a political scientist, but the environmental lawyer from whom we commissioned this opinion was unavailable to give this presentation. So hopefully I will still be able to give you a good rundown of the argument made in the legal opinion. So first of all, a word about Deutsche Umwelthilfe, or Environmental Action Germany. Suffice it to say that we are a large German NGO active on a wide range on environmental issues. We have a particular focus on fossil gas, including legal action against gas infrastructures such as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and LNG terminals. And we have a team of 5 people working on gas in the Climate and Energy Department, where I also work. All right, now to the legal opinion. So this was unfortunately only done in a German language. We do have an English language summary available, but we're currently working to update the legal opinion and also translate it to English to make it more widely available. So this was commissioned as a response to the publication of the draft of the delegated act on including nuclear energy and natural gas in the taxonomy in January 2022. The opinion makes 3 main arguments. First of all, that the authorization to propose the delegated act on the technical screening criteria has elapsed basically because the deadline specified in the taxonomy regulation has passed already. Secondly, that fossil gas cannot be classified as a sustainable activity under the regulation. This is what I will be focusing on in my further slides. And thirdly, that the German government has a duty to prevent the inclusion of fossil gas under Article 22A of the Basic Law. This is the article dealing with the protection of future generations and also the environment. Yes, given that the judgment by the German Constitutional Court in 2021 on the climate law basically imposes a comprehensive protection mandate extending also to EU politics. Right, new developments since the publication, which we're currently taking into account in the revision, is first of all that the official delegated act was published on the 9th of March. This weakens the criteria for the inclusion of fossil gas even further in 2 points, which I will be addressing a bit later. And secondly, the Ukraine war has substantially changed the entire context of the debate. We're phasing out fossil gas more quickly. The risks have become more apparent, and the new legal opinion will reflect that as well. Right. So, according to the taxonomy regulation, an economic activity can be classified as sustainable if it fulfills 4 criteria. These are cumulative, so they must all be met for an activity to be included in the taxonomy as sustainable. First, contribution or substantial contribution to one or more of the 6 environmental objectives, of which climate change mitigation is obviously one. Then it must not do significant harm to any of the 6 environmental objectives, including climate change mitigation. It must comply with minimum safeguards. I will not be dealing with that in detail here. And then it must also comply with the technical screening criteria defined by delegated acts, as is indeed the proposal to include nuclear energy and fossil gas that we are talking about now. So basically, the legal opinion argues that on points 1 and 2 of this list, fossil gas does not meet the criteria, or rather that the technical screening criteria as designed violate these two provisions. So first of all, what does the proposed delegated act say on fossil gas power plants in particular? So they can be classified as sustainable as long as they either meet an emissions threshold, so emissions intensity threshold of 270 gram of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. This is the do no significant harm threshold for energy activities. And it's notable that even modern fossil gas power plants simply cannot meet this criterion. So a second criterion was introduced to enable gas power plants to be labeled as green, which is a criterion relating to the installed capacity. And there it basically only specifies that the average annual emissions over 20 years must not exceed a certain threshold. And this is much more easy to meet than the emissions intensity criterion, and also allows substantial front loading of emissions. Then these new gas power plants must also be able to be converted to renewable or low carbon gases after 2035. And notably, it doesn't specify that these must be only green hydrogen or purely renewable gases, but also low carbon gases, which can still be associated with substantial greenhouse gas emissions. Then it must replace an existing plant of similar size, and it must produce 55% lower greenhouse gas emissions than the replaced plant over the lifetime of the new plant. So in 2 spots, these criteria were weakened between January and March. One is this 55% criterion, which was originally also an emissions intensity criterion, and now is applied over the lifetime, again allowing substantial front loading of emissions in the early years of operation. And secondly, the switch to renewable or low carbon gases was to happen in stages in the original draft, and now basically it is allowed to run unabated fossil gas power generation until 2035, after which a switch must be made. The criteria for combined heat and power are similar, but they don't have this additional 55 kilogram CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour criterion in the first bullet point, because combined heat and power production has higher efficiency and can thus meet the 270 gram criterion. Right. So to go quickly into how a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation is defined. I will only be, so first of all, on the left-hand side, you see the criteria for inclusion of greenhouse gas emitting activity as a transitional activity. So it can be classified as a transitional activity and therefore as making a substantial contribution if it is consistent with a pathway to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Also, if it does not hamper the development and deployment of low carbon alternatives, and if it does not lead to lock-in of carbon intensive assets. Similar criteria are applied to enabling activities, but since the Commission itself does not argue that fossil gas is an enabling activity, but rather a transitional activity, I will not be going into detail here. But it should be noted that these criteria are also cumulative, and if any of the following is not true, if it is not compatible with a 1.5 degrees pathway to build new gas power plants, if it hampers the development of low carbon alternatives, and if it promotes carbon lock-in, then it cannot be classified as making a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation. Now, to delve a bit more deeply into the material arguments in the legal opinion. So there's only one scenario, but according to the PAC scenario, that's the Paris Agreement compatible scenario for energy infrastructure developed by Climate Action Network Europe and the European Environmental Bureau, all fossil gas needs to be phased out by 2035 to stay within a 1.5 degrees Celsius budget. This implies an end to fossil gas power generation substantially earlier, since remaining fossil gas will still be needed in industry and heating, for instance, where it's much harder to phase out than in the power sector. Then methane emissions along the fossil gas supply chain are currently not properly reflected in official figures. This is a problem for all the emissions criteria, as the current climate footprint of fossil gas as reported does not fully affect methane leakages. Then zero emissions are not guaranteed after a switch to low carbon gases. This is because studies show that blue hydrogen can have a worse climate impact than fossil gas if methane leakage along the supply chain is taken into account, because blue hydrogen is still based on fossil gas. And also because actual capture rates of the carbon capture and storage facilities that do exist are not high enough to ensure that the climate footprint of blue hydrogen is actually better than just burning fossil gas. At least that's according to one study that looks at a wide range of scenarios and assumptions. So referring to the criteria of making a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation outlined before, it is doubtful that permitting new fossil gas plants beyond 2030 can be seen as 1.5 degrees compatible. These new power plants also promote substantial carbon lock-in, potentially even beyond 2035. And they have they allow for substantially front-loaded emissions, eating up the remaining carbon budget that the EU has quite quickly. And this in some also constitutes significant harm to climate change mitigation. So the new criteria outlined in the delegated act do not meet the same threshold as limiting the emissions intensity to the 270 gram CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour criterion. Just a quick work on methane emissions. So according to the International Energy Agency, energy sector methane emissions are 70% higher in actual terms than indicated by official figures. This is because figures are based on industry self-reporting, usually based on estimates or emissions factors. this is a problem, particularly in the supply chain, as major EU gas suppliers, such as the USA, Russia, and Algeria, are all among the top 5 global sources of methane ultra emitters, according to recent Kairos satellite measurement data. So the map here shows some particularly high methane emitting events along major pipelines leading from Russia, but also in the US, particularly related to LNG production. So yes, basically this must be taken into account in the climate footprint, and it currently is not. This will not be addressed by the upcoming EU methane regulation either, because in the currently proposed form, it does not include fossil gas imports, which are responsible for the vast majority of methane emissions associated with the fossil gas consumed in the EU. Now, there was another important criterion for classifying an activity as substantially contributing to climate change mitigation, and that's is that it must not hamper the development of low carbon alternatives. The legal opinion argues that this is, though, the case for the gas power plants, first because investments in new power generation and heating compete with sustainable alternatives for limited funds. This has also been outlined in the first presentation, so I will not be going into it in more detail here. Also that fossil gas generation directly competes with renewable alternatives if the full load hours of new gas power plants are not limited to providing a backup only function. Because for gas power to actually contribute to an increasingly renewable energy system, it must not compete for load, but must be relegated to this backup role where it only jumps in, particularly the closer we get to 2030 if insufficient renewable energy generation is available. Then using renewable or low carbon gases, meaning typically hydrogen, for power or heating competes with much more efficient uses, for instance, in industry or transport, where decarbonization alternatives are scarce. And given that the actually available hydrogen volumes are likely to be quite limited, now building sort of a fleet of new gas power plants that will then switch after 2035 to using those gases competes or hampers the decarbonization of industry and transport in particular. So in some, new fossil gas power and heating plants hamper the development of low carbon alternatives and therefore cannot be classified as contributing substantially. Now, my penultimate slide deals with the impact of the Ukraine war. This is from a first draft of the revised legal opinion that currently isn't published. So gas demand was already set to decline quickly with the Fit for 55 package, as it was already set to reduce fossil gas consumption by 100 billion cubic meters until 2030. For reference, Russian gas imports to the EU in 2021 were 155 BCM. Now, the Repower EU communication outlines a plan to reduce this by an additional 55 BCM. So this is a massive additional reduction in gas demand, and it also seeks to scale up efficiency and renewables to provide security of supply in a more sustainable way. So the decision to include fossil gas in the taxonomy locks in future demand and is completely at odds with these other developments that the EU has undertaken since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It undermines climate protection efforts and sustainable alternatives, and it also creates additional future gas demand to potentially benefit Russia. So in light of this, the proposal needs to be withdrawn and fundamentally re-evaluated, since the context that led the Commission to propose the delegated acts is simply completely different. And this entails also that a new impact assessment and consultation are made necessary by these events. We would have like to have seen that in the first case anyway, since this delegated act wasn't properly consulted or impact assessed, but given the new context, it is all the more imperative. So in summary, the delegated act, including fossil gas in the taxonomy, is at odds with the underlying taxonomy regulation. It provides no substantial contribution and cannot be seen as a transitional activity because of the arguments outlined before. And it also causes significant harm to climate change mitigation efforts. And the completely different context after the Ukraine war makes it all the more necessary, since it has also highlighted the huge security of supply and physical security risks associated with continuing to rely on these energy sources, and even granting them a green label, which they absolutely do not deserve and should not be granted. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the very good overview into the other side of the problem, the gas. Meanwhile, I'm happy to say that a member of European Parliament, Jutta Gutteland from S&D, managed to join us. And with her colleagues, she will start now with short inputs on the strategy discussion. I would like to say, we now see, of course, where the problems are. That's obvious. Now, I think it's, since we know so far only the European Parliament can stop this, this disaster happening. I think the key issue for the last minutes we have is to find out what are the strategic points that could help us to convince other members of the European Parliament to change their opinion and also to vote against it. I think that's the truth, what we're discussing right now. Therefore, I would also quickly, I know there is more, but from my perspective, there are following arguments we can use and used already, and some more perhaps. So we already had here now, of course, the topic of Russia. When I quickly may talk about nuclear, it means that it became, of course, even more obvious how this is not an answer, mainly for CE countries who are fully dependent on the Russian supply for their nuclear power plants. So this could be an important argument. Then, of course, this damaging of the basic idea, I think, became clear. So this is the liquidity of the financial markets, which would not be reached, as we see. Similar, perhaps someone might know the disclosure regulation is also connected to the taxonomy. And I understand that taxonomy aligned will be possible only for companies over 500 employees, which is really a lot, mainly when you think of the renewable industries in countries where it's strong, which is Denmark or of course Germany and Austria. Then we have this Article 290 problem, which is about the delegated act and whether the European Commission abused it, so to speak. I think this is an important argument, of course, for the European parliamentarians as such. Yeah, I think there will be more. So I would now ask those members of parliament who are here. We have to say that Bas Eickhout from the Greens cannot join us now, as he is in the plenary meeting on further Russian sanctions. So this is, of course, a very important job he's doing there. So I would ask those who are here, Mrs. Jutteland and Evelyn Egner from S&D, and later Michelle Rivasi and Cornelia Ernst, for a short 1 or 2 sentences, what they think would be the key points on which to continue the debate in the European Parliament. And this would be also the start, of course, for our audience to say their opinions or ask questions or give input. So Mrs. Jutteland.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the participants in this webinar, a roundtable. I listened to the previous one, and I must say that many of the arguments are very strong, and also the reason why I did hand in my objection in March, and I will stand by it. And I also know that my group is very, I know Evelyn is here too, but we are very committed, and we had a good discussion on this, and we are very eager to make sure that the taxonomy has criteria and works as it should, as a good standard for green investments. And we believe that it is not possible to do that and still allow for these to expand the taxonomy to energy sources that is obviously not compatible with the criteria that we are demanding from others. I know how difficult it was to argue for the taxonomy as it is today, to those who fight for investments that will make their sector greener or their energy industry greener. And they know that with the taxonomy, it might be very difficult to go further, because it is very tough criteria sometimes, that you shall not even have impact on biodiversity when you invest in the new plant. You need to be compatible with so many criteria, and you cannot harm at all. And we all know how difficult that is. And we had to argue, I know in Sweden we had to argue with different from the bioeconomy, and also when it comes to the water energy. We had to argue a lot because it was really tough criteria. It would actually be not only rude, but very, very unexplainable to say that we can make nuclear and natural gas into the same label as you. So we would put actually natural gas in line with biogas, or we would put nuclear in line with solar energy. So I can promise that I will argue, and that I feel that this is not doable. And I think what's said here that it's doubtable that permitting fossil gas plants beyond 2030 would be compatible with the 1.5 degree. Of course it's not. We would be locked in for the future. That's what we would do. And we cannot do it. And I think all of us saw the IPCC report this week, and that we got even more encouraged to work faster, not slower. Then, of course, we have those who says that the war that we need with this transition and the war, we need to change the imports to new countries and not change our ecosystem for the energy supply. I would say this would be another lock-in economically. That would be going in one direction that we know is a U-turn for Europe. Why would we want billions of euros into this U-turn? Why do we want tax money and the society to be part of that? Because that's what it is. Also, if we help the companies to take that turn, that would be extremely economically irresponsible. When we know that the solar and wind power is so strong today, and we have the opportunity to invest so much, and we also know that we have technology today that is much more compatible with the weakness that we had before, that we could actually turn this weakness of the wind not blowing every day into new techniques where we can capture what we actually had before and use it when we need it. We know we have that now. And we also know with the solar plants that they are also much more effective and much more economically reasonable today. So why, when we have the answer in front of us, why do we want to lock us in to the old technology that will not help the Green Deal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So your main argument is to go for renewables now that we have it. So you show the alternative. Okay, I would like to continue with the Member of Parliament, Cornelia Ernst from the left group. What would be her arguments why to vote against the CDA and try another path?
Ja, zunächst erstmal sorry, dass ich etwas zu spät gekommen bin, aber ja, das Leben ist manchmal sehr hart. Ich sehe hier Claude Thomas, ach, wie schön. Sei gegrüßt. Ja, vielleicht, als ich das nach Silvester hörte, habe ich gedacht, also es ist ein Scherz, was hier auf uns zugekommen ist. Die Kommission ist trunken vom Neujahrssekt oder sowas Ähnliches. Ich konnte das gar nicht fassen, weil es ein Rückgriff auf eine Dinosaurierpolitik ist, mit der wir hier zu tun haben. Wenn man sich das wirklich anschaut und
Excuse me, Madam Ernst.
Where is the problem?
This is the IT team. Could you please change the language at the bottom bar of your screen? Because all languages are mixed up. Could you please choose German?
Habe ich gemacht.
Great,
I've set it to German.
Okay. Klappt das jetzt?
Does it work now? Is it
Ist es in Ordnung?
properly? Can you
Können Sie
now
mich gut
properly
verstehen?
hear me? Can you hear me?
Okay,
Is
dann gehe ich davon
everything
aus.
fine?
Gut,
I assume everything's fine if I don't hear
so,
anything from
ich
you.
glaube, man muss
So,
am Anfang wirklich deutlich
believe
sagen, dass man die Taxonomie und alles, was damit zusammenhängt, nicht missbrauchen darf und politischen Spielen unterliegen darf. Und das Allerwichtigste, wenn Sie fragen, was ist das Wichtigste, was wir jetzt machen müssen, ist zu kämpfen, im wahrsten Sinne des Wortes, im Parlament, dass wir wirklich jede einzelne Stimme gegen diesen Unsinn mobilisieren. Und zwar aus den verschiedensten Gründen. Und ich kann mich entsinnen, dass so etwas auch schon gut gelungen ist im Parlament. Ich bin noch Mitglied des Innenausschusses. Dort haben wir dann zu Kollegen gesagt, du ruinierst deinen Ruf, wenn du hier zustimmst. Komm, wir müssen hier anders agieren. Also ich glaube, das müssen wir auch ganz offensiv angehen. Von alleine wird da nichts. Das nächste ist, wenn das so sein soll, Gas, Atom als grüne Energie oder als zuträglich für die erneuerbaren Energien einzustufen, dann bedeutet das eine eminente Investitionsentscheidung für viele Unternehmen, die sagen, okay, das ist doch grün, da kann ich das machen. Also das muss man ja im Auge haben, dass wir hier dann investieren und wir reden jetzt, ich komme aus einer Kohleregion, von Just Transition, was wir nötig haben. Ja, ich komme aus Sachsen in Deutschland, da muss der Kohleausstieg vonstatten gehen. Hier bräuchten wir aber auch wieder eine Ausstiegsstrategie aus dieser Infrastruktur, die ja jetzt in Größenordnung da ist. Und wenn wir uns die Gasindustrie und Infrastruktur anschauen, europaweit, wir haben 43 Pipelines, wir haben 8, die im Bau sind. Das sind riesige Investitionen und das verlangt ja auch eine Ausstiegsstrategie dann wieder. So, der nächste Punkt ist für mich diese ganze Frage Endlager. Oder ich erinnere mich daran, als wir in Brüssel große Angst hatten, auch in Bezug auf Deutschland, weil dort ein Atomkraftwerk beschädigt war. Und es auch große Schäden anderswo gibt. Also dieses große Risiko, was wir doch auch wissen, spätestens seit Tschernobyl, wo nichts mehr bewohnbar ist, und Fukushima, ist doch klar. Also wie kann man auf so eine Idee kommen? Das ist deshalb gut, dass diese rechtlichen Argumente gekommen sind, weil wir natürlich mit der Emotionalität nicht vorankommen, sondern wir brauchen unbedingt natürlich diese rechtlichen Argumente, um im schlimmsten Fall hier auch vorgehen zu können. Vielleicht noch ein Punkt, was mich auch maßlos stört seit Jahren, das ist diese ganze Subventionierung von fossiler Energie. Und das würde ja hier deutlich weitergehen. Und die neue PCI-Liste, ja, eines unserer Feindbilder, kann ich nur wirklich sagen, im Parlament, die 98 Projekte hat, allein 20 Gasprojekte, muss man ja mal festhalten, fördert ja hier eine ganze Menge. Und ich glaube, die wichtigste Botschaft, die wir senden müssen, ist, wir brauchen wir brauchen wirklich diesen Ausstieg, nicht nur wegen des Ukraine-Krieges, sondern generell auch aus der Gasindustrie. Wir wissen, wir können das nicht alles sofort machen, aber jetzt das aufzustocken, noch mehr Infrastruktur zu schaffen, ist ein riesiger Fehler. Und letzter Gedanke, Erneuerbare. Wir brauchen ein riesiges Investitionsprogramm. So, jetzt würde ich sagen, als deutsche Abgeordnete eine Art Marshall-Programm. Und das für Europa. Es ist erforderlich und ist der einzige Weg, den wir auch beschreiten können, hier zu investieren und nicht das Geld zu verplempern in Gasprojekte oder diesen Unsinn zu betreiben mit der Atomkraft. Da müssen wir vielleicht auch mal noch ganz anders mit den französischen Kollegen sprechen, die ja über die Hälfte der Atomkraftwerke in Europa halten. Und keine falschen Geschenke machen an Macron. Ich denke, das kann man ja auch an der Stelle mal sagen. Letzter Satz. Reden mit den Kollegen im Parlament ist wichtig. Jeden einzelne Gespräch hier wirklich zu suchen, um, ich sag mal, auch unsere Ehre zu retten als Parlamentarier und einen solchen Unsinn nicht zuzustimmen. Vielen Dank.
To fight for each and every vote in the parliament and to really talk to everyone. And I think it's also very interesting to say that this would be, of course, continuing subsidies into fossil fuels, which should end. I think this is a very valuable argument. Before we ask Mrs. Evelyn Regner for a quick input on their argumentation, we would like to welcome Mr. Stefan Renner, who joined us from the Austrian Ministry of Climate Action and will speak later. Yeah, and then we still have Michel Rivasi at the end before we open the floor to everyone. Please, Mrs. Regner.
So thank you very much. I will be very brief. I mean, according to this, what has been presented right now, I think what is needed is joint action. I mean, those who are willing really to work on alternative arguments, and this what is on the table, I think there should be really an ongoing joint cooperation cross-party. And in this regard, I think also against the political background where we are right now. I mean, looking at what's going on in the Ukraine, the only push could simply be to not be afraid of everything that is happening right now, but to be far more proactive and simply joining all this energy that is amongst those being today together, but thank God also amongst others as well, as strong as possible together. And therefore, once more, simply, again, thanks for this initiative today. And it should be a follow-up, and it should be a loud voice in order to go on to put all the arguments on the table that have been presented today.
Okay, thank you. And so, Michel, please.
Bon, moi, je trouve ça très intéressant, toutes les interventions, parce que ça nous a donné d'autres arguments. Mais je me disais, vous n'avez pas parlé du rapport du GIEC qui vient de sortir. Ce rapport du GIEC qui nous dit on a 3 ans pour vraiment avoir une orientation complètement différente. Je rajoute à ça la guerre en Ukraine, et qui montre notre addiction en fait aux énergies fossiles et la dangerosité des énergies nucléaires. Donc, je me dis que c'est maintenant ou jamais. Il faut convaincre, et là j'aurais une question quand même à poser à Wolfgang Poentner, qui nous parlait des marchés financiers. Comment faire pour informer les marchés financiers, qui sont investisseurs publics ou privés, qu'il ne faut pas investir dans les énergies fossiles, qu'il ne faut pas investir dans le nucléaire, parce que c'est quand même eux qui vont mettre des milliards pour orienter notre chemin sur les énergies renouvelables. Et donc, il faut qu'on arrive à faire une contre-offensive vis-à-vis de ces marchés financiers, et lui, il peut peut-être nous amener des éléments et des arguments pour qu'on ne finance plus les énergies fossiles et le nucléaire. Donc voilà ce que je voulais vous dire, moi, parce que comme mes collègues, que ce soit Evelyne, Cornelia ou d'autres, il faut maintenant qu'on mette le paquet sur les énergies renouvelables parce qu'on a peu de temps et il n'y a que dans les énergies renouvelables qu'on pourra mettre en œuvre dans les années qui viennent l'énergie qui nous manque. Et en même temps, il va falloir qu'on forme les consommateurs, qu'on leur dise qu'il faut rentrer dans la sobriété énergétique parce qu'on ne pourra pas remplacer l'énergie d'aujourd'hui par les énergies renouvelables. Il va falloir qu'on entre dans l'efficacité énergétique avec la rénovation des bâtiments pour diminuer notre consommation d'énergie fossile et autres, mais aussi sur la sobriété. Donc je crois qu'il faut présenter ça comme un package. Maintenant, dernière chose, il faut qu'on gagne. Il faut qu'il y ait une objection au niveau du Parlement et il faut qu'on arrive à convaincre sur l'urgence de changer de voie. Ça, c'est le rapport du GIEC. Il faut montrer que investir dans les énergies fossiles, c'est 2030-2040 pour le nucléaire, etc. Donc, l'humanité ne sera pas là tellement il va y avoir une augmentation du réchauffement climatique. Il faut qu'on arrive à trouver les 353 députés européens pour qu'ils votent cet objection. Voilà. Donc j'ai espoir.
So I am hopeful. Let's hope we make it. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so I see is also now, of course, the getting out of fossil fuels is, of course, also reached a much higher level of importance right now. The question now, of course, also for all the NGOs around is, of course, perhaps we also still should try to contact members of parliament. We know since every vote counts, I think this seems to be making sense. Do we have other comments from our audience? Questions, suggestions?
I believe Paulina Boyer is asking for the floor.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for these presentations. I just would like to add a word on the IPCC report from regarding the nuclear aspect, and just a few key points. So for over 20 years, the cost of renewables has been falling. And so the word nuclear is appears twice in the report. And actually, the IPCC refers to nuclear power as an example of technology requiring high initial investments, whose use is significantly reduced in model trajectories that assume more efficient use of resources, or that orient global development towards sustainability. So in other words, IPCC showed that nuclear power is not a structuring solution for developing efficient energy policies and enabling the emergence of sustainable societies. Another thing is that solar and wind power together, so solar and wind energy power together have 9 times more potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than nuclear power by 2030, and at a much lower cost. So this is one of the graph of the summary for decision makers. And another argument is that in comparison with modular small unit size technologies, the empirical record shows that multiple large-scale mitigation technologies, which allow fewer opportunities for learning, have seen minimal cost reduction in their adoption, and their adoption has grown slowly. So those arguments are really strong arguments we should add to fight for the exclusion of nuclear from the taxonomy. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We also got messages concerning email campaigning and the urge to contact the members of parliament. In my understanding, this is, I think, useful, as we see there's also a broad range of arguments. So this could be a way forward. We also have Gabi Schweiger from the Austrian NGO Atomstopp, who wanted to say what she's thinking about it. Gabi, please.
Ja, herzlichen Dank für die Möglichkeit. Ihr könnt mich hören?
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please.
Great, thank you. It is important to get every MEP to consider a no. I had to leave twice, but I think this aspect perhaps hasn't been mentioned hitherto. This procedure as to how the presentation of the Delegated Act came about, this is something we also need to reject. And I think one or the other MEP could also be convinced to say no when you point to how the Commission has circumvented the European Parliament. We now have the draft, and the Parliament wasn't consulted, just as the public wasn't consulted, and the Parliament can now vote either by nodding or by saying no. And I think whether you are in favor of gas or against gas, or in favor of nuclear or against nuclear, I think this is a procedure that wasn't okay. And this is also something we are going to mention in all of our emails, that there wasn't sufficient political democracy when it came to the establishment of this law. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We also got this input that we think that mainly those groups represented here are largely, obviously, against the CDA the way it's now. So a little bit the question would be also, again, perhaps the members of the parliament and others, what could be the arguments? We know that with the Renew group, there is still a lot of lobbying and convincing to be done. What do we think? What would be the arguments for them? With the EPP, there is a lot of context also from our German colleagues, but this would be perhaps to discuss in the last 5 minutes we have for this discussion. What are the ideas? What would help to discuss with these groups? Yes, I see. Cornelia Ernst, you wanted to speak on this.
Ja, ich glaube, jeder Abgeordnete hat das gewisse Interesse, vielleicht doch nochmal wiedergewählt zu werden. Und es macht immer Sinn, in den einzelnen Wahlkreisen deutlich zu sagen, wie gerade so diese Abgeordnete oder diese Abgeordnete diese Position vertritt dazu. Möglicherweise irgendwer sagt, ja, ich finde die Atomkraft ganz großartig und das ist eine grüne Energie. Das muss man schon erstmal erklären seinem Wahlvolk. Und ich glaube, so einfach ist das auch nicht. Auch wenn der Ukraine-Krieg schon einiges verändert hat. Aber ich glaube, es ist wichtig, auch vor Ort die Menschen zu konfrontieren, dieses Thema aufzumachen, was hier läuft, wie viel davon abhängt, Aufklärungsarbeit vor Ort zu machen. Häufig wird ja so getan, als ob das ein großer Unterschied wäre zwischen dem Europa und dem Mitgliedstaat. Das ist es hier natürlich nicht, wie wir wissen, wie auch sonst nicht. Also ich sehe darin auch eine Möglichkeit, Druck auszuüben und auch mit NGOs vor allem gemeinsam hier zu agieren.
Thank you very much. We all, if I may say so, I also think this is the most.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Of course, sorry. No, absolutely.
No, it was my fault. I was late.
One second.
1 second. Can I? Yeah. I just want to say that I do believe it's possible to win this one in the parliament, but I believe what it's many times about when there are still also those who feel fear about this transition. Of course, since some member states are more dependent, and there will definitely be a fight there. But there, I really believe it's about the commitment that we, the groups who are committed, and also delegations. I mean, there will be some variations also in our groups, but the delegations who are committed, that we actually put lots of emphasis on this question. So we cannot go in and hope for the logical argument to win, but it's very much about how much focus, how much debate, how much and how much tension and attention does this get in the parliament. And there you come in, NGOs who are here, because you can also help that this question to get that attention.
Yes, thank you. We saw that François Vallée, you also raised your hand. Ah, please, François.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes,
bonjour à tous
hello,
et à
thank you
toutes.
very much for giving me the
Dans les
floor.
arguments qui ont été évoqués,
From the different arguments
il y a un
that
argument
I've
que je n'ai pas
heard,
entendu,
there's one argument that I
qui est
have
le
not
fait
heard of.
que le nucléaire dit civil,
that
c'est-à-dire de production
the
d'électricité,
civil
est
nuclear, so the one
lié
that is used for
au
electricity
nucléaire militaire.
production, is linked
Et
to the
donc,
military production.
l'entrée du nucléaire civil dans la
What we
taxonomie
call
européenne
civil nuclear entering
serait
the European
une manière
taxonomy would be a way
de favoriser également la poursuite des investissements dans le nucléaire
the
militaire.
pursuit of
Donc, je
investors
voudrais savoir
in
si ça fait
military
partie
nuclear.
de vos
I would like to
réflexions,
know if this is
notamment sur
part of
l'aspect
the points you are
juridique
reflecting on,
de
especially on the
contestation du
judicial
nucléaire,
aspect
l'entrée du
when
nucléaire
it
dans la
comes to
taxonomie.
contesting the
Parce
nuclear
que ça
in
me semble
taxonomy.
vraiment très important, en tout cas du point
It
de vue
seems
français,
quite important, at least from a French perspective,
de bien faire le lien entre les deux
to
et
understand that there is a
de
link in
trouver
between
tous
the
les
two
arguments
and
juridiques pour
find all the
empêcher
legal
que des
arguments in
investissements
order
dans
to
le nucléaire
prevent
civil
any
se retrouvent
investments
également dans le
in
nucléaire militaire.
civil nuclear find themselves in
Merci.
military nuclear. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think this has to be looked into. I haven't seen anything on it yet. Before, we would ask Charlotte Mijon from Sortir du Nucléaire, an NGO in France. Michelle Rivasi, I saw raised her hand, please. Michelle?
Oui,
yes.
J'étais sur les arguments.
I was
Le problème
reflecting on the
qu'on
different
a, c'est qu'il
arguments.
faut
The problem that we are
convaincre
facing is
Renew,
that we need to
il faut
convince
convaincre le
Renew,
PPE et le
we need to
CR.
convince the PPE and
De
ECR.
mobiliser les ONG,
We
c'est
need to
très
mobilize
important.
the NGOs,
Mais
which is
je
very
voudrais, et
important.
comme il y a
However,
Wolfgang Poitner qui est là,
while
il faut montrer au
Wolfgang and
PPE
Buckner
et à
are here, we
Renew
need to
qu'il n'y aura
demonstrate
pas
to
de
everyone
financement.
that there will,
Et
no
il
be,
faut
there will not be
que
any
les
funding.
marchés financiers
And the
disent,
financial
si vous mettez le
markets
nucléaire et le
must
gaz dans la
say that if we
taxonomie,
put
on
nuclear and
n'ira
gas in
pas.
taxonomy, we will
C'est pas parce que
not
si on
take this
perd
direction. We will
que
not go
les
in this
finances
direction.
iront dans ces énergies. Et
It
je
doesn't
voudrais
mean
son
that
avis.
all the
Est-ce
financial
qu'on peut
institutions will
avoir
pursue that road?
une influence en tant
If
que
we can have
député
an
ONG
influence on
pour
this
que
as an
les
NGO
marchés
deputy,
financiers
so that
disent
all
on
the
n'est pas d'accord pour
investment
aller
markets
dans
can
les
say
énergies
out loud
fossiles
that
et
they
dans le
disagree
nucléaire.
to
Parce
go
que
towards
ça
fossil energies
montrera
and
au
nuclear
PPE
energies.
à
This will
Renew
demonstrate
qu'il n'y a
to
aucune
Renew that
alternative d'aller
there is
là-bas.
no
Vous voyez ce que je
alternative
veux dire?
taking this
Parce
direction.
que
You
le
understand what I
PPE et
mean?
le Renew, c'est l'argent.
Renew and PPE
Et puis il y a
represent
un troisième
money.
argument, c'est
And
le
a third
temps.
argument will
Et c'est
be
là où il faut qu'on s'appuie sur le
time.
rapport du GIEC.
And we need
Le
to
rapport du
focus
GIEC, il
on
dit
the
on a quelques
IPCC
années.
report.
Qui,
This one
mieux
states
que
that
les
we
énergies
just have
renouvelables,
very few
peut
years.
fournir
Who else
de
than
l'énergie
renewable
en si peu
energies can
d'années?
provide
C'est ni
energy
le
in so
nucléaire,
little
ni le
time?
gaz.
It is not nuclear and it is not
des
gas,
oléoducs et il faut
because we
construire de
need
nouvelles centrales
to
nucléaires.
build
Donc
those
moi, je
new
suis très pragmatique.
nuclear plants
Il faut
and
arrêter le
oleoducs. So we need
financement
to
et
stop
comment motiver les
financing
marchés
these and how
financiers pour
to
qu'ils ne donnent pas
motivate
un
the financial
euro,
markets for
pas
them
un
not
dollar
to
au
invest, not a
nucléaire
euro,
et
not a
aux
dollar to
énergies
nuclear
fossiles.
or fossil
Comment
energies.
on peut faire?
This is what we need to do. How can we do it?
Okay, I thank you very much. So we're back to financing, of course, fossil fuels. I see Mrs. Regner also wants to have a few words before we then ask Charlotte Mijon for her closing remarks. The first of many closing remarks.
So sorry to come in once more,
yes.
But what you raised is so important. I think we have to underline that. I mean, when you mention, okay, to do all this by a delegated act, and therefore this contribution was so important. So somehow it's something like wiping away the issue to something where there is not so much debate. But we are talking about something where we need this huge debate, where we need to be loud, where there is action needed very quickly. And therefore, I think this is a very important point. I'm in the ECON. I'm not in the Envy committee, so we're always debating it from the whole financing standpoint. And Michelle, you just raised this point. I mean, okay, there are political parties who are always focusing on money. But even if we focus on money, I mean, time's running out. And therefore, I think just this argument with us, I mean, the thing we have to do in the European Parliament is simply to take also members who are hesitating, maybe from their honor or their pride, when they are not open enough for all these climate arguments, simply to take them. Could that be that there are members in the European Parliament not being involved in an appropriate way because something is coming from the Commission? Because we have to give our input as members of the Parliament. So somehow to go with this argument, and that's what we are trying in ECON. So in addition to all the content arguments as well. And so thank you very much for this argument, and also thanks for being loud. Without being loud and without having all the NGOs and those fantastic kids that are going on the streets, we won't push it.
Thank you very much. The absolutely last remark, please, Mr. Pointner, and then we really have Charlotte. I'm sorry we are running late, and I'm afraid that ministers will not have so much time.
So I just wanted briefly to answer the question by Livasi. And I think that it's actually the argument should be that all the taxonomy has been trying to achieve is to create this deep and liquid market. And by including something like nuclear or fossil gas, you would really ruin that liquidity in the market. And that is actually not what you want to achieve. And actually, you would really foil all your efforts. And then even for those MEPs who are more market-oriented, pro-market thinkers, like the people from the Renew group, they should really understand this, that actually the market that they wanted to create would be reduced to scrambles, and then that couldn't be their intention, I would think.
Thank you. That's of course very important. Charlotte?
Oui, bonjour. Vous m'entendez bien?
Yes, can everyone hear me? Beautiful. I'm going to try and be very brief. I know we don't have much time. To start, one thing I would like to remind everyone is the role of the strong French lobbying and the French industries to reach this decision. Considering what we have done in France to put in place the French nuclear that was never validated by the people or the representatives, and this was imposed on us, I would like to remind everyone how it is despicable to see France impose these methods on the European Parliament when the European Parliament had refused the imposition of nuclear in the taxonomy. So this democratic game is important to underline. Moreover, what we see is that we have finally a program that is built according to the French projects regarding the relaunch of nuclear. EDF and the French government have the will to pursue the French nuclear party. And if maybe they want to put in not only 6 reactors, but maybe 8, And we have a lot of candidates who today want to relaunch the nuclear energy, which demonstrates clearly that the French nuclear lobbying managed to knock on the right doors, let's say. It is why it is more of important to fight against this inclusion of nuclear in the taxonomy and to do whatever it takes to prevent it. And something else that I wanted to underline, and I know they have already been said, even if it doesn't create a massive capital flux towards nuclear, because I see that investors are not completely crazy and they know that it is not nuclear. The nuclear is not an investment, a positive investment for the future. There will, whatever investment will be too important and will be a lesser Europe involved in other solutions and other energy solutions. And it is important to make sure that the nuclear in this taxonomy is mentioned as a transitional energy. It was already been said, we don't have a lot of time ahead of us because of the climate change that is having a very high impact, but we need to consider and we shouldn't be speaking so much of an energy that is so long to develop and this is polluting so much and creating so much defects. This energy doesn't have a low carbon impact. We are also late. The IPCC recognizes it. The development of nuclear was inferior to what was expected in all scenarios established. Coming from there, we need to seize discussions on such a slow technology. In France, in Finland, and in Brittany, we have examples of a lot of reactors that are just being delayed further and further. But today, 3/5 of the reactors that are being built are also being delayed. So betting on nuclear and keeping nuclear is a risk of missing our objectives when it comes to fighting climate change. What I would also like to underline, which is quite important, is that with the nuclear energy, it's as if we wanted to kind of keep in the horizon some miracle solution that would help us fight against climate change without changing our production systems or our consumption systems, which are not sustainable. This is very important to demonstrate too, to see how if we continued in nuclear, if we continued to support nuclear, we would therefore just continue supporting a myth or a lie of a miracle solution. And we need to end this game so that we can finally face the reality and take the necessary measures. I won't take more of your time, but I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this view from France. We have now from Greenpeace Luxembourg, Roger Spaus, please.
Thank you, Patricia. I will try to be short. I want just to raise 2 points. One is that after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, that the European leaders have announced that they want to become more independent from Russia in the energy sector. If nuclear will be included in the taxonomy, that will undermine all efforts to become more independent from Russia. As I think most of you know, the part of the nuclear industry in the European Union is heavily dependent on Russia, be it for fuel production, for maintenance, for infrastructure, or for waste handling. Just to give you 2 recent examples, is the flights which took place from Russia to Slovakia to transport fuel for Slovakian reactors. And then other example is the recent transports of reprocessed uranium from France to Russia to be re-enriched. If nuclear will be included in the taxonomy, this will be also an incentive for lifetime extension and to build new reactors, and which will mean that we, or at least part of Europe, will continue to be dependent on the Russian nuclear industry, on Rosatom. A second point which I want to mention briefly is which shows how desperate the nuclear industry is to get nuclear included in the taxonomy. In the EDF annual report of 2021, they mention under risks related to financing and the regulatory framework, and I quote, "In addition, the classification as transitional energy under taxonomy regulation could insufficiently recognize decarbonized nuclear electricity with potential consequences for access to financing for new projects. The text does not include the fuel cycle or waste management. Finally, the conditions set out in the Delegated Act for the classification of nuclear energy as an aligned activity may not be fully met. These elements could influence the group's ability to finance future major nuclear projects." This shows clearly that the nuclear industry, and especially the French nuclear industry, EDF, and the French government, they will continue to fight to get nuclear included in the taxonomy, and they will try to influence the members of the European Parliament to include nuclear. We have seen this morning that there are different options for legal action, and I think depending on the votes in the European Parliament, it will be necessary, be it for governments or NGOs, to take legal action against the Delegated Act. And the last word is that Luxembourg and Austria, they have already announced that they will take legal action in case that gas and nuclear is included. But I think it will also be important that these two countries will be joined by other bigger countries like Germany. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also to pointing to this major dependence on the Russian industry. It's way more than fuel. I also prepared 2 short papers, and there will be more. There is a structural dependence. So it's Russian companies which run a large share of the nuclear power plant, maintenance, all the way also to checking the primary circuits and even exporting for EPRs. So in Hinkley Point C, there is also the insides are actually under Russian control. So we have now Claude Thomas, who has the floor now.
Thank you, Patricia, and it's great to see all these people today gathered to fight for rejecting this completely absurd proposal of Commission. And I will give 5 arguments why we should do it. The first is this is anti-democratic. Imagine that Commission would take the same approach in other areas of policy. So a delegated act and the EU treaties are very clear. This is for non-substantial issues. And why is there a supermajority needed both in Parliament and in Council to reject this legal act? Because it is only for non-substantial issues, for very technical issues. So this is a frontal attack on European democracy. Tomorrow you could imagine the pesticide lobby getting a delegated act that pesticides have to be considered in organic food. You could do the same trick. So this attack on the European democracy cannot go through. And that's one of the main reasons also why our government with Austria, and Roger is right, we should continue to campaign that Germany and the German government is joining us on this legal attack. The second issue is the financial actors. So Luxembourg is the world's biggest trading place for green bonds. And it is so evident the financial sector doesn't want this to happen. And this has been very well explained by Wolfgang Peutner, because you will destroy the liquidity of that market. You will create an administrative burden on the financial sector, because nobody will invest in a green bond where the manager of the fund will not be able to show that there is no nuclear in. So I think that Michel Rivasi is right. I think the NGOs should now do also in parallel a campaign on the financial actors. No euro, no dollar. And I think it's so evident the financial actors are not vocal enough. They are really so scared by what could happen, but we need to motivate them, and I think NGOs should work on this. On nuclear, I think you have rightly mentioned EDF is bankrupt tomorrow if this doesn't go through. And are you aware that Mr. Levy is today the president of Eurelectric? So I think we should also, as NGOs and activists, send mails to Eurelectric. Why are E.ON, RWE, other renewable committed companies allowing Eurelectric to be run by somebody who is in the old world? And there is another man which we should not underestimate also when it comes to the parliament's vote, and that man's name is Bill Gates. And I really urge European Parliament to look into the agreement between President von der Leyen and the Bill Gates Foundation. There is a written memorandum of understanding. Bill Gates wants small modular reactors, and Ukraine war has shown what a disaster that would be. So don't underestimate the Bill Gates Foundation in the lobbying effort to get it done. And in the parliament, you should have a look at that. On gas, what is important to understand is we have no time. So we have to go out not only of Russian gas, we have to go out of all gas. And therefore, what is happening in this very moment, also this common gas purchase at EU level, this push for a lot of new infrastructure is very dangerous, because we have a carbon budget. This carbon budget will explode if we allow too much long-term contracts. ENGIE has now done a long-term contract on 20 years with America. So that means huge contract where I am forced to pay even in 43 to buy gas from US. So what is also important for the European Parliament, you have to question European Commission on their management of the EU common gas purchase platform in order to make sure that we don't buy more gas than our carbon budget is allowing us to do. And we are reducing the gas in Europe, 100 BCM under our 55% climate target, an additional 55 through the repower. And what we need now also in combination of the climate urgency and getting serious on embargo against Putin. So one embargo which will hurt him is the gas embargo. But that embargo is only possible if we do a very aggressive, professional, in all European countries, energy saving campaign. And I have started over the last 2-3 weeks to work on that together with IEA. Today there is a meeting in Brussels between IEA and European Commission. So what we need now is, in parallel of organizing a campaign against this law and this delegated act, or this vote in Parliament, we need also to get more pressure on the European Commission to organize a European campaign where we save away oil and gas and coal. It's the only possibility to be able to do a real embargo against Russia, and it's the only possibility to stay on a climate compatible path. And so we need measures like reducing speed on highways, home office, but it doesn't make sense to make that at the national level. We need now to do that at EU level, and that can be launched, I think, in parallel, and that will show we don't need more gas infrastructure, and therefore there is no need for taxonomy. I think it's really the moment we as policymakers, as NGOs, as committed cities, it's a moment to be courageous. It's now or never. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very passionate and very long-term strategic point of view. And we have now Mr. Stefan Renner, who is policy advisor to Leonore Gewessler, the Minister of Climate Action in Austria, who could not be with us, but I'm sure it will be an interesting contribution to our discussion. Please.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. Regards from Leonore Gewessler. She's in the Ministerial Council at the moment. I think everything ahead is said already, and I would just reinforce what Claude Thomas basically said. And I would just give 3 points because we are running late. First point, I think taxonomy, it's about sustainable finance. Yes, on the one hand, but it's also about energy policy. I think now we're in a situation with Charles Michel just announced new sanctions, with von der Leyen also mentioning gas, not only oil and coal, but also gas as a possible next step. I think it has to be clear to everyone that this bridging technology, that gas is a bridging to something else, has collapsed. The bridge has collapsed, and we have to realize that we don't have this bridge anymore. It's from oil, coal, directly to renewables, because the new geopolitical situation doesn't allow anything else. Same with nuclear. Second point, what do we do with this delegated act? I think at this moment now, also as Claude said, we have to find democratic majorities in parliament. I think also with this new geopolitical situation on energy security, also like the conservatives could understand and could support that this delegated act comes from a different time and is now not relevant anymore. And also when we look at the different procedures now in the council, we see that next week we will have the green bond standard in Coreper. Austria will break here the silence procedure also to bring a discussion also on a green bond standard here. And I very much, of course, and we will discuss it later, Claude, would very much like to see the support by Luxembourg. As you said, the green bonds are in Luxembourg an important issue. So basically, the second point, democratic majority and the European Parliament is here crucial. And the third point is, and that what I think was discussed today, is the legal challenge. I think Claude said it right. It's undemocratic. We give the European Commission a huge leverage, and this is not what a delegated act is supposed to do. That's why we prepare at this moment within our ministry the case for in case this delegated act comes into force. We prepared a case. We actually received a lot of support pro bono from all kind of retired professors all across Europe. So we see that we have a lot of support. We look at different member states who can support us. We have Luxembourg. We look at other member states. And then we will, in case this comes into force, we will bring this delegated act to the court. That's from the Austrian situation very briefly now. I think this delegated act comes from a different time. Overall, the sustainable finance agenda by the European Commission has a lot of good things, many good things. With this delegated act, we have the risk, and we hear this also from DG FISMA, by the way. We see the risk that this positive sustainable finance agenda is at stake and is risked to be taken hostage by the fossil gas and nuclear lobby. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's good to hear that there will be really a lot of initiatives coming from the Austrian ministry, obviously in cooperation, of course, also with Luxembourg, and trying to find other countries to join. I also think that the Germans might consider to be this passive support if this legal challenge is necessary at all. But before, I believe there will be a lot of activities in the European Parliament. And we as NGOs will try again. I think it's a very good idea to really try that the electorates themselves contact their constituencies and their own members in the parliament, so that they see that they're, so to speak, being watched, also when they are voting in Brussels or in Strasbourg. We managed to be only 9 minutes late, so I think it's time to say goodbye. Let's keep in touch. And yes, many thanks for the very good discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, and good luck for the vote. Huh? It's the best parliament of the world, so it can only win.
On espère. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Michel.
So. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you, Michel.
Merci.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot, and we do our best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Au revoir à toutes et tous.
Bye to everyone.
Merci, au revoir.